Ever since the first Economic Freedom Network of North America meeting where I met Dr. Kelly, we were really surprised to see the parallels that exist between Mexico. By the way, where's the clicker? Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. The parallels that exist between Mexico and Hawaii when it comes to economic freedom. And we were really surprised that in our first measurement, 2 Mexican states ranked above Hawaii when it came to economic freedom. How was this possible? How is it that an American state, a state from the land of the free, could rank below a Mexican state where we are not really known for being a really free country, for what you might have heard? So, first of all, before we can get into the title of the conference, why economic freedom matters, we have to define economic freedom to know why it is important. So, in short, economic freedom means that the choices of the individuals are the ones that decide what and how goods and services are produced. This occurs via the free market, and so economic freedom is the right of individuals to choose and decide how to use their time, how to use their talents, and how to use their resources. We can then say, and this is the definition that we use at the Fraser Institute for the measurements, individuals have economic freedom when property they acquire without the use of force or fraud or theft is protected from physical invasions by others, and they are free to use, exchange, or give their property as long as their actions do not violate the identical rights of others. Individuals are free to choose, trade, and cooperate with others and compete as they see fit. So, economic freedom is different from other kinds of freedoms, like political freedoms and civil liberties, in that it covers a different area of social relationships. Political freedoms, of course, means individuals have a right to participate in the political process. Civil liberty means individuals have the right to think however they see fit and act however they like, as long as, of course, they don't encroach the rights of others. However, the foundation of these freedoms, of economic freedom, political freedom, and civil liberty is the same. The rights of the individuals to choose, the importance of voluntary interaction, the right to get involved, participate, and of course the rule of law. So those are the four cornerstones of economic freedom: personal choice, voluntary exchange, freedom to enter and compete in the markets, and protection of persons and their property. So let's go back to that personal choice. In order for a person to be economically free, he has to have the right to decide. What does he consumes? What does he produces? How does he uses the money he earns? Voluntary exchange. As you all know, when a transaction occurs in the market and it's voluntary, both of the parties are benefited. When a transaction is not voluntary, usually just one of the sides involved is the one who gets the advantage. Commerce and trade is not a zero-sum game. Both of the parties are better off after the trade. And there's this story on a Mark Twain novel that I hope most of you have read, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, where at the very beginning, Tom Sawyer is painting this fence white. And at some point, he convinces another kid to paint the fence. That's not the story I'm trying to tell. After that, Huckleberry Finn comes and says, I have a spider I caught on a matchbox. And Twain actually shows the spirit of commerce, the spirit of voluntary exchange. Because Tom reaches into his pocket and takes out, I believe it was a bolt or a nail, and he said, let's exchange. Huck gives him the spider, Tom gives the nail in exchange for that, and Twain says, and after the transaction, both kids felt richer than at the beginning. They exchanged garbage, but in the heart of the voluntary transactions is that whenever you conduct a transaction, you are richer than before you did, because you value what you're getting in exchange more than what you're giving away. So then, freedom to enter and compete in markets. I'm going to go deeper into that later. And protection of persons and their property, the rule of law. When we have an environment in which we know our property rights and our bodies are really protected, we get to, we participate in a better way on the free market. But I'm going to get deeper into that. So a country or state has economic freedom when private property is defended, there are institutions that defend and enforce contracts, there is a sound monetary environment. This is really important because that's another form where we know our property rights are protected. Expansive monetary policy takes away the monetary value of our money, and therefore it's an encroachment in our property rights. When we have monetary expansions, our money starts being less and less valuable, and so it's a way of theft. Taxes are low or null. I don't know if that's the way to translate that there are no taxes, the null. Is that understood like that? Okay, and there are no barriers to entry to the markets. I'm going to go back to that as I told you. And no barriers for foreign trade, no Jones Act laws or that kind of laws that actually violate economic freedom. And the economy depends solely on economic means and not political means. What's the difference between economic means and political means? There was this thinker called Oppenheimer that said economic means are the means of voluntary interaction between humans, while political means are the means when you try to get power over other people. So that's the difference between economic means and political means. What is voluntary and what depends solely on power. So but not only governments should provide protection, they should not interfere in personal choice. For example, recently in Mexico, we passed new tax codes that taxed high caloric, non-traditional foods. So all the bread, for example, or cookies or other kinds of junk food got high taxes, as opposed to local foods that are really high caloric, but they didn't touch that. And the goal was to incentive people to get their calories elsewhere, not from junk food, to stop the obesity epidemic. And that's an interference in personal choice. And they've done the same with soda, alcohol, and tobacco. So now we have obese smoker alcoholics that are less free and a state that has a real obesity problem. So it's worked out good for them, the state, and bad for us, the consumers. They are now pushing for taxes on bottled water. So it's kind of different to understand what the rationale is. First, they want us not to consume soda because it's high caloric, and then, of course, that is an encroachment into personal choice and voluntary exchange. So now they're trying to save us from being well hydrated, I think. So the other, they shouldn't participate in markets.
Can I?
Yeah, sure.
It's a little bit there you go.
The participation of the government in markets drives out competition. In Mexico, we have a lot of that, you know, as all of you may know, or most of you may know, Mexico has a monopoly, state monopoly when it comes to oil and gasoline. They're trying to change that now, but what happens is no one can compete against a public firm that has access to unlimited budget. And when I say unlimited is, if they start running out of money, they can take debt, they can inflate the currency, or they can tax us higher. So it's really difficult for a private firm to compete against a public firm. And that way, if government participates in markets, they drive out the competition from the private sector. The government shouldn't restrict the entry to markets, as with occupational licensing. I've heard stories in the US of government required licenses for jobs, like an interior decorator or hairdressers need licenses. So to be able to use a blow dryer professionally or to help people pick wallpaper and furniture, I have to ask permission from the government. That really encroaches into economic freedom. So to cut hair for a living, you should be able to cut hair for a living. And if you give people really bad haircuts and accidentally chop a couple of ears, it would be the individuals exercising the right to free choice who would drive you out of market or make you famous. Terrible haircuts and frosted tips were everywhere in the early 2000s, so that's a thing. Well, so government shouldn't tax and spend as well. Taxation reduces the possibility to keep our own earned money and limits decisions, and government spending pushes away private investment. So that's what a government shouldn't do. So how do we measure economic freedom? At Caminos de la Libertad, we like Peter Drucker's old saying, what can't be measured can't be improved. And that's why we participate with the Fraser Institute in their economic freedom indices. And the Grassroots Institute, of course, is part of that network of think tanks that participate in these measurements. The economic freedom of the world is a way that we measure economic freedom. This is at the country level. And this is what we measure. The size of government, the legal structure and property rights, sound money, freedom to trade internationally, and regulation. And at the state level, we do this work that Dr. Aquina was mentioning, the economic freedom of North America. This is how we measure that economic freedom. Government spending, this we measure as consumption by government as percentage of income, transfers and subsidies received by every state, insurance and retirement payments, and government enterprises and investment. The second area is taxes. Income and payroll taxes are the first thing we measure, property taxes, and then excise and sales taxes. That one, the excise and sales taxes is, I think, one of the points where Hawaii does worse when it comes to economic freedom. We're going to see the numbers later. Regulation is another area we measure, labor market regulation, specifically the minimum wage, government employment, and union density. Those others are in other color, the other three, because this we use to adjust to a national level to make Canada, the States, and Mexico comparable. And that's the legal system and property rights. Of course, Canada and the States have similar legal systems, and their property rights are equally respected, but Mexico has it really bad when it comes. We don't even have a definition of private property in our Constitution. Article number 27 says all the land belongs to the state, and the way that private property works in Mexico is they loan it to a person. Sound money, of course, inflation, and of course this one has to be measured at the national level. We don't, not every state or states don't have their own central banks, so they can inflate their currency. And finally, freedom to trade international, and this is something I was speaking with Joe Kent about, that there is no, the Jones Act and laws like that are not factored in yet in this index. Of course, it's a work that we are trying to perfect, and we're going to be including Puerto Rico, I think, next year, and then we will add variables to include this Jones Act. So the measurements we're about to see, when we see Hawaii ranked in freedom to trade internationally, you should think, okay, that's the figure I'm seeing, but the score must be worse, even because of all these laws that limit international trade or free trade in our states. So how does Hawaii do when it comes to economic freedom? This is the Hawaiian evolution of economic freedom versus the U.S. average. Hawaii is really below the U.S. average, and this is from 1981 to 2015. That is the last year we measured. I'm getting feedback. Well, so as you can see, it's really low. It follows the same trend as the states, but it's in the later years, it's in the middle sixes to low six. The rank goes from 0 to 10. So when you are around 6.5, you are getting a mediocre rate. So this is Jalisco. This is the best ranked Mexican state when it comes to economic freedom. It goes above the Mexican average. But if we can see, it goes to the mid-six. So this is what we find surprising when we only measure state government and municipal governments. Hawaii ranks worse than some of the Mexican states, Jalisco being the most economic free state in Mexico. Of course, when we add the factor of the legal system and property rights, sound money, and freedom to trade internationally, Jalisco goes below Hawaii because the Mexican government is really centralized And when you add the variables for the federal government, it makes every state worse. So, of course, you should factor in the Jones Act that is not measured here, and Hawaii could be even farther below Jalisco. So, well, this is the 3 areas of economic freedom for Hawaii. In the blue, you see Area 1, that is government spending. It has been raising its rank for the past 10 years. That means spending has become lower when compared to personal income. Area 3, that is regulation. Well, the labor market has been deregulated for what, or other states in the union have gone worse. That's we measure max and mins, so that means either you're getting better or other states are getting worse. And finally, the worst area you have is taxes. You haven't gone over 5 for the past 5 years, and that's not a mediocre score, but a really bad score. This is how. I don't know if you can read that, but these are all the areas we measure in economic freedom of North America: consumption, spending, transfer and subsidies, insurance and retirement payments, income and payroll tax revenue, tax income, top income tax rate, top income tax threshold, property tax and other tax revenue, sales tax revenue, minimum wage, government employees as a percentage of total employees, and union density. As you can see, your worst area is sales taxes. You get a 0.6 out of 10. It's lower than 1. You're the 50th out of 50 states in the United States. So this, I was talking about this with Joe. You have a really high sales tax, and the fact that it's general and not to final consumption makes it even worse. It was 4.4, you told me, right? It's one of the higher, and the fact that it doesn't go to final consumption also makes it, it's not a value-added tax, but a sales tax per se. It makes it worse. The other one of the bad areas is the union density. You rank 4.7 out of 10, and that means unions are, well, most of the workers are unionized, and that limits the ability of the people that are making the jobs to hire, to fire, and to fixate whatever wages they can agree between employers and employees. So those are the worst areas. The best area you've got is a minimum wage. You've got one of the lowest minimum wage in the states. Of course, you rank 16 out of 50. And also the transfers and subsidies. Hawaii is not one of the states that receive a lot of transfers and subsidies. And you're ranked 16th also out of 50. 16th is not great. It's middle of the table at best. So what can we improve here to make Hawaii one of a more free state? The states, well, there's a lot of area for improvement. That's one of the advantages when you're at the bottom of the table. Every little change matters. And that's the thing. When you have climbed down into the crevasse, you now have the opportunity to climb up, and that's the only thing. It cannot get worse. Of course it can, but it makes a lot of areas of opportunity you can have to improve your economic freedom ranking. So, well, the topic was, why does economic freedom matter? And all the data I'm about to show you is from the national from the economic freedom of the world, where we measure nations as a whole. And what I'm going to show you is a couple of graphs, well, not a couple, actually around 10, where we can see how does economic freedom relates to other variables, to other economic variables, to other social variables. So to see how economic freedom works and why is it good for us. And of course, since it's measured on a national level, it would be hard to measure this at the state level, but it holds. And we have in our published study, Economic Freedom of North America, in 2017, there's a couple of these graphs that show how at the state level these relationships behave the same way. So the impact on prosperity and development, this at the farthest to the, it would be the left for you, You can see the most free nations of the world, the most free quartile, and on the farther to the right, you see the least free nations of the world. And what's the per capita income on each economic freedom quartile? So as you can see, the most free nations of the world have a higher per capita income. Then we have growth and development. The most free you are, the more you grow. Economic freedom, the poor, and inequality. So this kind of disappointing when you look at this, because if you are worried about inequality, this might say economic freedom has no effect on inequality. As you can see, this is the least free countries are almost as equal when it comes to income distribution as the most economic free countries of the world. But the thing is, economic freedom is no solution for equality, but here's where the miracle occurs. This is how we measure the income of the poorest 10%, and these are purchasing power dollars, purchasing parity power dollars. I don't know, do anyone knows the actual translation for that? So, when we see the income of the poorest 10% in the most economic free countries, it averages over $10,000 a year, while on the least economic free countries, it doesn't reach $1,000. Yes, it doesn't help with inequality, but it makes the poorest people better off. And this is what, at Caminos de la Libertad, what we're concerned with, poverty. Not equality. What we want is that people every day go to bed with a full stomach. We don't care if there's a guy that has 20 billion and a guy that just has 1 million. Or we want people to be able to thrive, and the best way is economic freedom. As we can see, the people in the poorest people in the most economic free countries are better off than they are without economic freedom. Economic freedom, governance, and democracy. As I told you, all the economic freedom, political freedom, and civil liberties all are based on the same fundamentals. And when we compare how it works, economic freedom and political rights as a countries, this is measured from the Freedom House Index and the Freedom in the World ratings, we can see that where there's more economic freedom, there are more political rights. There are also more civil rights where there is more economic freedom. And this relationship doesn't go one side. I'm not saying if you have economic freedom, you're going to have political or civil rights, because there are examples like Singapore that doesn't have any political rights or civil rights. It's a dictatorship, but they have high economic freedom. What I'm saying is, usually they go hand in hand, and where you have economic freedom, you're laying the foundation for the development of other freedoms. Economic freedom and corruption, this is important. When there's no laws prohibiting you for developing your activities, like, as we say, the occupational licensing, there is no one you can bribe in order to get a license. If you don't need to get a license, there's no one you can bribe. So corruption is also less in the more economically free countries. And our indicators of well-being. This is the Happy Planet Index data for life satisfaction. And here are a couple of odd notes, because right here in the most economically free countries, you include some countries with low life satisfaction, as some of the Scandinavian countries, like Denmark and Finland. Those are sad people. They don't get much sun. And here in the third quartile and in the least free quartile are content all the Latin American countries, where people is really happy. We're poor, but we're really happy, we're joyful, and we're really satisfied with our lives even when we don't have economic freedom. Well, even factoring by that, the countries where there is more economic freedom are more satisfied with their lives. This one's important, literacy. What we can see in the pink is the male literacy, and on the yellow, the female literacy. And when we look at the least economically free countries, we see first Literacy is way lower than in the higher, in the most free countries, but the gap between female and male literacy is around 15%. When we go to the more economically free countries, the gap closes. And as we get economic freedom, well, there's a correlation between the gap of literacy among males and females. So, well, that shouldn't say conclude. I don't know what. The conclusion is economic freedom increases prosperity, reduces poverty, it improves other liberties, and it improves the quality of life. That is, I think, what we are most worried about, at least. So, well, more info is available on freetheworld.com. That's where you can download all of the publications from the Fraser Institute. Caminosdelalibertad.com. That's in Spanish, but if you know Spanish, you can get good info there. And that's my contact information. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Should I take it?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Jose. Thank you very much, Jose. You've done a great job in presenting this. By the way, if you want the Hawaii version of the Economic Freedom Report, just go to our website, Grassroots Institute, and we co-publish that with the Economic Freedom of North America. Jose, I've got a couple of questions for you, but I want to invite the audience. If you have any questions, would you just start lining up over here so that we can have you on camera? And I'll just start off. I see Mark coming up here, and so forth. Jose, good presentation. I want to go back on a slide first of all, and that is the income disparity. A lot of people in Hawaii talk about that as being an evil thing, that some people are richer than other people, and that what we need to do is close the gap. But what you're pointing out is that economic freedom does not emphasize that. It's not so much that the rich and the poor should have the same income. It's at the baseline, the poor get richer. It's kind of like what Confucius said, let the rich get richer, and let the poor get richer, and that seems to be a better solution. Do I understand what you're saying?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. The thing is, the economy is not a zero-sum game. It's not about we have a cake this large and we have to decide how do we cut it up. The cake can be larger, and the way that cake can be larger if we have institutions that protect economic freedom, if we have free trade, if we have a rule of law, if we have low taxes. When we add up, the cake starts getting bigger. And when the cake starts getting bigger, the poorest people get a better share of it.
So our goal should not be, in order to help the poor, to make the richer poor.
Well, we can have equality if we just divided all the money among, but everyone wouldn't be better off, and there would be no job creation. We're seeing it exactly as it is in countries like Venezuela right now. They have been, when you look at the aggregates, they have been getting more equal when it comes to the distribution of income. North Korea has that. And the thing is, we don't want all the people to be poor. That's the perfect way to achieve equality. We want the poor to be better off. We want the poor to have a better share of the cake, but let's make the cake bigger.
Right, and one of the benefits that economic freedom produces, as the stats show, you and I have talked about this, is it creates robust middle classes with great capacity, and they're able to drive the engine of the economy. The second question I have for you has to do with your work. It goes well beyond the academic. It goes well beyond making charts and tracking data and so forth. You didn't mention this, but I'd like you to say something about the way you are kind of like an economic doctor in Mexico. That there are various states that have figured out that they can actually quantitatively improve their condition, and their leaders actually can get credit for it. So you do these clinics, don't you, where you diagnose for various states in Mexico their economic condition using the tools of economic freedom, and you prescribe a solution. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, what happens is, I think the media is a powerful tool. And, well, no, I don't think. It's an objective fact. And what we did when we first launched the index was, let's put it out and let's say these states are ranking low, these states are ranking high. And every governor, every municipal president in Mexico wanted to be the one that got ranked higher. So they tried to start competing, and they said like, okay, well, come here, tell us what to do. So we got, of course, a lot of states that just went out in the papers and said, oh, we are the most economically free, and got their good media mentions and in the papers. But some of the lower ones were like, okay, we don't want to be ranked as low as we are, nobody wants to be at the bottom of a competition in whatever. So they said, come here and tell us how can we improve. And so just looking at some of the, you can make a lot of prescriptions on what you can do at the state and municipal level. Like right here, when you see like maybe you have a really high problem with sales tax and tax revenue as a percentage of personal income, what can we do? Well, let's analyze the impact of the sales tax. Let's work with some of the elasticities of the products and see if we can lower it. Of course, it can always be lowered. And you should look then, if you're lowering taxes, you should look at spending. Where can you cut? And when you look at it, every government has a lot of fat that you can trim really easily. So when you look at our variables, it's really easy to know where can we improve. So that's what we do. We go, we say, you have a problem here and here, and this is what you could do. And yeah, that's how we help economic freedom in Mexico.
I understand that at first some of these governors were somewhat afraid of you and what you discover as an economic physician, and now they're clamoring to have you come.
Well, it started as a really hard task because transparency is not a big thing in Mexico, and most of the government offices were trying to hide their data. But after we took them to court and squeezed the data out of them, well, they started seeing the value of the work we do, and they're not trying to improve in that.
Well, I wonder if we could take the collection over here so we could pay for Jose and his group to come and do some diagnosis and prescription for Hawaii. How does that sound? And then some clever politician could run on it to get reelected for increasing our standing in economic freedom. That sounds like a good thing to do. But I want to open up the microphone now. Several eager questions. Come on up. And first we have Mark. Just introduce yourselves and ask your question. Go ahead.
Mark Toriano. I have two areas I'm interested in terms of economic freedom that are in the press a lot, but may not actually be on your chart specifically, but probably in there somewhere. One would be drugs, the flow of drugs, the use of drugs, the permission of use of drugs, what's happening in the U.S. where marijuana is now becoming, in some states, legal and a big factor in the economy in some areas. And then also the flow of labor, the immigration issue. Not specifically illegal, legal, but just the movement of people, which we see discussed in the press, most visibly from Mexico to the U.S., and how that affects economic freedom. Are these two areas that you've thought about, and how does it fit in here?
Thank you, Mark.
Well, first of all, drugs. Well, there have been a lot of efforts, and we've been putting, we're really trying to improve this index. This is only the fourth edition. We've got the 2017 one, and we're trying to make it better year after year. And we listen to a lot of concerns of the members of the Economic Freedom Network as the Grassroots Institute. And one of it was the rule of law. And this has a direct connection with drugs, and of course it would really put us into a real perspective of how things work when it comes to economic freedom in some of the more violent states where the violence is related to drugs. In Mexico is the case of the northern border and the Pacific coast. States like Tamaulipas, Nuevo León, and Chihuahua have really bad problems when it comes to the drug cartels. And of course, the two states of Sinaloa and Michoacán that are mostly overrun by cartels. Now they are the government there. And, El Chapo leaves are well used to. And the thing is, we're trying to make it using a third, what's the word for it? Well, not where we don't do the direct research, but we find from third-party sources to try and find if there have been some research done on how thus the violence of drugs, specifically the violence of drugs, have had an effect on the economic activity. So by putting in those variables, we could make a better measurement of how thus the prohibition has an effect in some of our states. About the legalization in some states, we haven't really discussed more, I think it would have really, in the short term at least, a good effect on economic freedom, because people are now free to decide what they want to do with their bodies, with their own health. But it could have as a long-term effect a problem when it comes to spending, because if it becomes a health problem, a public health problem, it would increase the need for spending in the public health sector, and it would need the governments would need to start taxing in order to cover for that. However, what we advocate for is, okay, well, if it's going to be legal, you cannot have it be a public health problem, as in you don't have to have public hospitals treating people for bad decisions they take. That's the way we make it. We make it so that it doesn't have a negative effect in economic freedom. But of course, in the long term, it could mean an increase of spending into the public health, and so a lower economic freedom if we don't solve the spending problem.
Mark also asked for some of your perspectives on economic freedom and immigration.
Immigration. Well, we're doing a lot of work in research on that. I'm actually now presenting a paper at the Association of Private Enterprise Education Forum in April, and it's going to be on how immigration in Mexico and the states have an effect on economic freedom and on trade. But I'm not really right now. I don't have the figures. If you can give me an email, I can send you the working paper so you can check it out yourself.
Hi, I'm Mike Malahan. I split my time between Hawaii and the land. And my question is on NAFTA, though you didn't address it today. Two questions. First, I'd like your perspective if you think there will be a new NAFTA agreement. And secondly, on the optimist side, let's say there will be one in a year or two. What do you think the final trade-offs will be so that we'll have a continuation of NAFTA under the new agreement? Thank you.
Well, NAFTA is under heavy fire now, and of course the American government doesn't want to negotiate any further until we are past the election and we know who the new Mexican government is going to be. Mexico is not going, the election is not going great. We have the far left wing of Bolivarian candidate leading all the polls, and he's against NAFTA. He actually agrees with Trump that it's a bad deal, but he says it's not a bad deal for the states. They're getting the better part. We are the ones that are worse off with it. So if he gets elected, I could bet there would be no more NAFTA after that election, because they would agree that it's a really bad trade agreement. I also have something published on that subject, and the thing is, the importance of trade among both countries, it would be reflected as in the measurements of economic freedom as a part of the freedom to trade area, but as this is measured at the national level, it wouldn't have a big effect on the economic freedom measurements, but it would have a really deep impact when it comes to both of the countries. I think there's been a symbiotic relationship between the border states in Mexico and the states. Of course, there are higher wages, lower wages for Mexican workers, and that's something that really makes it alluring for the states to hire Mexican people, either legal immigrants or illegal immigrants. And how can we fix this imbalance between the both countries? We have to make, as they said in the negotiation, we have to make wages higher in Mexico. The thing is, you cannot make wages higher by signing an edict. You have to increase economic freedom so that more firms come to Mexico and there's more competition for the workers, and that way we can make it work. But right now, yeah.
Hi, my name is Cynthia Frith, and I was questioning on the very last slide that you showed about the disparity between literacy, between men and women, and the poorer the people became, the greater was the disparity. I find it very alarming and disappointing that so many women don't have a better idea or desire to become educated. I worked for years with pregnant teenagers in York, Pennsylvania, and I was wondering if that's part of and looked at in that figure of disparity as the women get less and less economically free because they're not literate, they can't get decent jobs, et cetera, they have children to raise. It's kind of a cycle that really, I think, has a real clout with that particular figure. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, of course, there is a correlation between poverty and literacy, but what we're looking at here is what they call a poverty trap. They're poor because they can't get out of poverty because there are no conditions, and the conditions that are trying to help them to stop being poor are actually making them poorer. What we see here is the least economic free countries. Most of them are African countries. Most of them are dictatorships like Venezuela or countries like Argentina that have real problems with economic terrorism by their governments. So what we see here is when we have least worries, you know, the Maslow pyramid of human needs. I don't totally agree with that theory, but as we get richer, we have more opportunities to go to school. What I'm saying here is, here in these countries, people doesn't get educated, but they don't get educated because if they go to school, they have to stop work. Well, they can't work for. Like you go to elementary school for 3 years, 6 years, and then you go to high school for other 3 years. And those 3 years is an opportunity cost. If I go to high school, those are 3 more years that I will be spending on my education and not getting anything back. And these people are really poor and they need the money. So they say, I'm skipping high school, I'm going to start to work, or I'm going to skip school all around and I'm not even going to go to elementary school. I'm going to start working from a really young age so I can get money. And so that's what happens in the lower economic free countries that are the poorer countries. And of course, what happens in most of these families, and there's studies that unfortunately I don't have one in my mind, but I've seen them where the thing is the oldest son is the one who goes to college, the one who goes to high school. And then maybe if he makes it big, he's gonna come and rescue us all. But the other 10 siblings, they're gonna have to work to try to get the oldest son to college. So that's.
I can see that. That's one profile, but I'm talking also about the profile of a family where there is no father involved, and there might be multiple children from different men, and they are not parented. And so and they get on welfare. And that cycle is huge, just huge in this country.
Well, I agree. The welfare programs make bad incentives for people to not get educated. And what happens there, of course, is you have your first son at age 15, and you interrupt your opportunities of going to college because you have to feed the child or go to high school or go to college. And so, yeah, that of course factors in a lot in the gap between male and female.
Well, I think that's what really startled me about all of your charts, is the disparity of poor people to start with, but then how disparity was put upon women. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd just like to comment. I appreciate what Cynthia is bringing up, that there are many problems in society, such as this disparity of income between the poor and the rich, that people call problems, as well as the circumstances of the disparity between males and females in terms of their ranking in different categories, such as income and so forth. There are lots of different causes, and many of them are subjective. They're very real causes. But at the Grassroots Institute, we're looking for the measurable cause that can bring about real change. And that's why we look at economic freedom, because as economic freedom grows as a measurable, identifiable factor, the conditions of people at the low end rise as well. And so one of the remarkable things is that the data is out there that shows that as economic freedom grows, the disparity between men and women actually decreases significantly over time, regardless of the specific causes of that disparity. That's why we're champions for economic freedom. We have a couple more questions. Lloyd?
So, my name is Lloyd, and I decided not to ask you that technical regulatory question that I spoke to you about before. I just want to ask, make a point and then just ask two questions.
Okay.
So one point about Hawaii sales taxes, we're sort of different because we don't run the education system off the property tax. We run it at the state level, so it's a little different, but that's just a technical point. So I have a technical question, which is about measurement. So when we do GDP calculation, we include government spending in it, obviously, but doesn't that create kind of a thing where you say, hey, good government spending, good, because GDP goes up? That's one question. Is there another way to kind of look at it? Might there be another way to look at it? And then the other question is sort of the big picture question is, many years ago we thought that China, because if China got more economically free, that would sort of create more political freedom, but we're seeing almost the opposite right now happening. So you want to comment on that one?
Sure. Well, I would recommend, on the first question, I would recommend you the work of, what's his name? Well, the thing is, there's an alternative measurement for GDP that it's called gross output. And I think the economist's name is Mark Skousen. That Skousen. Mark Skousen, he has a lot of papers on making that change, on improving the measurement of the GDP. And it doesn't include like the double account there are for, because some of it goes to taxation, then goes as a spending and as how's it called? As private consumption, so there's some double measurement in the GDP as well. But yeah, that gross output measurement is one good alternative. Mark Skousen is the economist. And what was the other question? Sorry.
China.
Oh yeah, China. Well, as I told you, it's not that the relationship goes one way, and you can have economic freedom without political freedom. That is possible. Thing is, there's a correlation, but it's not a causal relationship. So yeah, that's why China doesn't do that great when it comes to political freedoms and civil freedoms. But I mean, what we're trying to show only is there's a correlation, but exceptions can happen. It also happens in some of the Arabian countries where there are no civil liberties whatsoever, but there is a high economic freedom because they don't have high taxes because of oil.
Sure, thank you. And we have our last question here from Catherine, and then Mark, if Mark is very quick.
Yes.
I think that part of the analysis of China, and we can talk about this later on, has to understand that there are at least two systems going on in China. In the broader China, you have the more traditional impact of the politics of China, but you have special economic zones such as Hong Kong and Shenzhen, and those are the ones to focus in on to see the impact of changing the economic freedom factors. Okay, Catherine, real quickly, and then Mark, and then we'll close up for today.
Thank you for speaking today. My name is Catherine Hensky, and I love the fact that he is suggesting I be very quick. I have a couple of points of clarification I'd like to ask you. In one of your slides, you stated that property ownership would create less poverty. Is that correct?
Well, it has a correlation to, yeah, yes.
Okay, so the poorest of the poor, how do you suggest they obtain property?
Sure. Okay, what's the other one?
The other one is, if I heard you correctly, you stated that you're in favor of raising the wages for workers. And I wonder about the correlation of how that would hit the businesses versus how it would help the workers.
Oh, sure.
Okay?
Okay. So,
Thank
yeah, I
you.
think on the first one, how would poor people get property? Let me talk about an example in Mexico. When you look at Mexican agriculture in some of the poorest states, like Oaxaca, that it's in the southern Pacific coast, there's no cartel problem down there. So what we see is that most of the land is government owned, and they loan it as in a figure called the ejido. And the ejido, here's how it works. Some agriculture community goes to the government and says, we need land to exploit. The government loans them land. And so there are no incentives to actually invest in good, as they start growing, like they have the loan for the land and they start growing as agriculture business, they have no incentives to take care of the land because it's not theirs. So they usually deplete and go ask for another parcel. There's no incentives to invest in riego. What's a word for irrigation? Yeah, for irrigation. Yeah, well, no, but specifically irrigation. So what I'm trying to say is the incentives that private property, that the defense of private property rights create, make it so you can compete in a more even way. Now, how can poor people get their property? It's a part of the second question. Of course, I'm not saying we should increase wages by a decree. I'm against that. I don't think that's a way you can fix the economy. What I'm saying is, as more firms are competing in a particular economy, that drives wages up. So what do we need to increase wages in Mexico is to get more firms to come to the country, or to get more firms to develop, national, local firms. And that way they have to compete to offer the worker better conditions of work. Not the other way around. If we make a law that says you should offer this, okay.
Very good. And for our final question, real quickly, Mark, and then Jose.
Thanks for being here. Well, on the question of property in Mexico, basically, what is the likelihood that the concept of private property will be firmly established down the road? And the economic freedom movement in general, we're doing our part here in Hawaii, but what about in Mexico? This is part two of that question. What is the likelihood of success down the road for the economic freedom movement, and what do you call it there? I mean, is it libertarianism or free market or right? I mean, what kind of labels are you using to achieve this goal?
Okay, we in the Spanish-speaking countries, we haven't lost the term how to the left, so we call ourselves liberales. That means liberals in the classical Adam Smithian sense. That's how we call ourselves. Is there, what are the possibilities of the property rights changing? And what we have actually managed to build some momentum now, and the movement for liberty in Mexico has been growing. And right now we have only two, a senator and a congressman that agree with these ideas, and they've already started pushing for changes in the Constitution that would make private property definitions real. Of course, they're not getting it approved, but the fact that now we didn't have this 10 years ago or during the neoliberal revolution 20 years ago, there was nobody speaking of property rights. Now we have a senator that goes there and try to pass a bill that would make private property possible. The fact that we are now talking about it, I think it's a huge step forward. And yes, in maybe some 10 years time, we would have access to real property rights and all that. But yeah, the momentum for economic freedom from liberty is really growing in Mexico right now.
Well, Jose, thank you very much. Give a big hand to Jose Torra. Good job. And before Jose sits down and we release him to you to have some conversation privately, I do want to say that he plays a very important role in terms of what we're doing at Grassroots. We are trying to find measurable solutions. In other words, you may wonder, why does Grassroots write about this particular land use policy or the minimum wage or labor market and so forth? It's because we have a blueprint called economic freedom. We actually want to improve the condition overall of the economy in terms of economic freedom, and step by step provide a prescription to the state so that we actually bring about solutions. So I want to thank Jose for his work, and thank you for all of your support, and aloha from the Grassroots Institute today. Thank you. Good job.
Thank you.